Alexander John Shaia. Croeso I Gymru, welcome to Wales.
Thank you.
Thank you for having this interview for the Church in Wales today. You've travelled fair distance, been here about a week, you say?
Flew from the States a week ago.
And you're finding the rain unusual.
I've been to Wales a number of times, but where I come from in the States is quite high and dry in the mountains. We have very little humidity, so the wetness here is luscious and it makes me cold.
Yeah. So you are a spiritual writer and mystic, anthropologist, I believe,
Yes.
and traveller. And I know that you've recently written about Quadratos and an approach to the four canonical Gospels, looking for a deeper spirituality through a process. Could you tell us about that?
And I don't know how many people here may be aware of a mythologist in the United States in the last century called Joseph Campbell. And Joseph ended up being one of my seminal teachers at university. And he talks about the fact that there is one story that's going on across the planet, he believes across the cosmos. He calls it the hero's journey. And that journey has four parts to it. And the first part is hearing the summons to the journey, and the second part is facing great trials and obstacles. And the third part is receiving the gift, or what he calls the boon. And the fourth part is returning to community with more responsibilities. And at the same time that Campbell was teaching me this at the University of Notre Dame, and Campbell was teaching the theology department, we were discovering in those early days of the 70s that early Christianity was particularly looking for four texts that would be called the gospel. Before they decided anything, they decided the number 4. And nobody has adequately explored or described why that was so important, that it wasn't that they were looking for just the true stories of Jesus, but that they had to adhere to 4 parts that would make up a whole. Okay. And so it was a 30-year search, prayer, study, and finally in the year 2000, this, I don't know what to call it, this insight, this revelation came where I finally saw how each of what we call the 4 Gospels, each text is one part of that great human journey. So the whole Gospel that we call Matthew, Campbell would describe as the text of waking up and beginning a new journey. And the text that we call Mark, Campbell would describe as the text of facing trials and obstacles. And the text that we call John, Campbell would describe as receiving the gift or the new insight. And the text that we call Luke Acts would be the text of returning to life, returning to community with more response abilities. Okay. So that insight that arrived after all those years has really, for me, reshaped the text as the story of Jesus the Christ, not only a person and a historical reality, but also a reality across time, but a reality that's a journey, so that Jesus the Christ is not just a figure at some place on the journey, but Jesus the Christ is the wheel of those 4 places that we constantly are going round. This is not a linear, but it's a cyclical, a spiral, or maybe even a labyrinth dance. Okay. Where you move in and you move out, you move in and you move out. And to make it even more complex, all 4 of those places are going on at once.
Right. Interconnectedness then about your approach, though there are 4, there is one.
Yes, and I go back to this comment, this writing of Bishop Irenaeus in the year 170, who's the first person that we have a writing of talking about the selection of Gospels. And he starts out his treatise by saying there is but one revelation, and we must have 4 accounts. And that seems so strange because we have lived through the last few centuries believing that we have these accounts because they are the basis of the life of Jesus, which they are. But why and how did this 4-ness arrive? And why was it that they were looking for something about the life of Jesus that would adhere to the 4 parts? And what I show is that that early Christianity, as we all know, is built upon our mother Judaism. And the great metaphor in Judaism for the journey with God is the Passover night. And the Passover night is organized around 4 questions. And that that Passover in the time of Jesus was nothing like we observe it today. In the time of Jesus, Passover was an evening where the head of the household simply asked 4 questions of those at table, almost as an examination of their spiritual life. And those 4 questions are very much like the 4 questions of Campbell. You were a slave, your ancestors were a slave in Egypt. Where tonight do you feel enslaved? Your ancestors wandered in the desert. Where tonight do you feel like you are wandering unto death? Your ancestors crossed into the promised land. Where tonight do you feel you or hear God's new promise in your life? And finally, with the last cup at the end of the meal, it took 200 years for our ancestors to build the country of Israel. What are you committing yourself to do between now and next Passover to build up your family, your community, your tradition? So those 4 questions were the basis of Passover that every Christian in the early centuries of Christianity would have known because we come out of a Jewish stock. So when Irenaeus says there is but one revelation, meaning there is but one journey that we make with God, and there must be 4 accounts, I believe he was referring back to the 4 questions of Passover, which refer to the 4 places that we constantly circle through on our way to God, on our way deeper into God. And that therefore early Christianity was looking for each gospel text that would answer one of the 4 great questions. And I believe they rightly chose from amongst the 50 texts that we know that were written, they chose these 4, not because there aren't other true stories of Jesus, but these 4 have the question and the practice. Matthew, the practice of how we face change. Mark, the question of how we move through trials and obstacles. John, the question of joy and union. And Luke, the question of how we mature in greater service. And then what happened for me backing up from this moment in 2000 where I finally saw a way to understand how the 4-ness become one, go back to all my anthropology work. We know that in anthropology, my field was to study great rites of initiation. Around the world and across culture, all the great rites of initiation are imagined as having 4 parts. The same 4-step sequence to transformation. And then we look at the world's great traditions. We can see the same 4-ness in the metaphor of the 4 Noble Truths of Buddhism. We can see this same 4-ness in the world's great sacred literature. We already know that this 4-ness is the core of the great Passover story. My other great love is the Navajo peoples that I live close to in the American Southwest. And they have their great story called the Dine Bahane, which is their creation story, which is exactly a mirroring of these same 4 parts. And I've also had the great honor to be close to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and to hear their mythology, which also adheres to this 4-part sequence. And so what I'm describing is that religion across the world has argued the costume, the figures, but when we get down to the actual walking of the path, we're all walking the same path. Campbell said it could not be otherwise, because his word is there's only one great story going on, and in my words, there's only one great God, and that great God has a journey that we all walk, and each one of us walk it by different content. We walk it by different metaphors, but the journey's the same.
Well, we're sitting here surrounded by nature now, the rain pouring down all around us in a beautiful part of Wales, and place of Celtic spirituality, obviously for thousands of years, and a place of the early church in this edge of the world, as was known in the time of Jesus and the disciples. Does the Celtic tradition have interest for you?
Yes, and I wish that I knew deeper the Celtic tradition. But what I do know is that when Christianity left the Mediterranean, and the whole first centuries of Christianity, as we stayed basically in the Mediterranean basin, we stayed with the Jewish metaphors, we stayed with the Jewish marking of time, and we stayed with the Jewish seasons, and we stayed primarily with the Jewish moon calendar. When we went north of the Alps, the Celtic world, and I like to remember that in my studies, the Celtic world went from Ireland to Turkey, but never came below the Alps. That Celtic world was organized in a very different way around the seasons, primarily the sun, and how the sun moves through the seasons more than how the moon moves, and also the great tree. And those two elements of Celtic spirituality came into Christianity, and totally we refashioned ourselves. We did what Christianity does when it's at its best. It says, tell me your story and we will understand what we know through your story. And so we left aside for the moment our Jewishness of the Mediterranean region, and we took on the entire Celtic calendar, and we understood the Celtic world and the Celtic metaphors through the great story of Jesus the Christ. And the great story of Jesus the Christ was not sacrificed, it was amplified, because when Christianity lived in the Mediterranean world and when Christianity met the Celtic world, in that whole long epoch of time, we were an indigenous tradition. We were a tradition of earth and water and sky, and therefore we could meet another culture which knew the holiness of nature, and there could be a marriage between the Christian tradition and that other tradition that enriched both. So my anthropological work and my work and where I live in the States is amongst the Native Americans of the peoples of the Southwest. So it's primarily the Hopi, the Pueblo, and the Navajo. And those are the stories and those are the spirituality that I most know. But I have this small amount of knowledge and great love of what happened to the Celtic world when they gave of themselves to the Christian world.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Celtic connection?
I think, let me give you one example of what the Celtic world offered the Christian world. You know that one of the great moments of the Celtic year is the winter solstice.
Yeah.
And yes, there is some elements of the winter solstice that's in the Mediterranean world, but it did not play largely until Christianity came across the Alps and came to the Celtic world and understood. We said to the Celts, tell us what you are celebrating. And what we heard in that was, on the night of the winter solstice, the Celts are understanding that they must help nature regenerate. And also understanding that it's always at the deepest dark that comes the turnaround, that comes the rebirth. And we knew from our spiritual practice of Jesus the Christ, from Judaism through the early centuries of Christianity, we know that Jesus, the deep new grace of Jesus the Christ is always born in us in the place of the deepest dark.
Right.
Therefore, when we met the Celtic world and understood how they were celebrating the winter solstice, we said, nature is telling the story of Jesus' birth.
Yeah.
So therefore we have a nature reason for the great spiritual celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought incarnation and we brought matter and spirit together, which is what Christianity always does when it does its best. Is it never gives us only a theological or historical feast. It gives us the theology and the history rooted in incarnation, rooted in nature and matter and in us. So, and the whole Celtic year then became the Christian year as we understood the Christian story that matches the Celtic story and in our language opens it deeper.
Okay. And so now you're traveling and you travel most of the year, right? I know. What is the purpose of your traveling now?
So many years ago I wrote the book of this idea and thought I could write the book and then move on to other things. And what I've discovered is that people need to hear me talk about this material before they can, many people, before they can pick the book up and really understand what this is. Because this book is not just an idea, it's a practice. And I actually think the people of the world will tell me this, but I think that this may be a significant reshaping of Christianity in the way that many are looking for.
Yeah.
And so I want people to understand the layers of this work, but primarily I want people to understand how each of the four Gospels form a whole, and that whole is not the Jesus journey alone, it's our journey in Jesus. So that these texts are not about another reality, these texts are about us. And it's just amazing to me that as you put these four texts end to end, that they happen in us exactly in the sequence that we see in the Gospel. That chapter by chapter by chapter, as we read Matthew, we are reading the gift and the challenges that we face as we try to wake up deeper.
Okay.
And as we go through the Gospel of Mark, we're seeing not just the challenges that Jesus had or the disciples had, but the challenges that we have in our thinking and our feeling as we are in times of great difficulty.
I see.
And John is that powerful text about how we are obligated to refashion tradition over and over and over again, and that refashioning is discontinuous. And this is something that people don't understand today. Grace works in two ways in us. Grace works in small increments, and then there comes a moment when grace takes a leap. And tradition sometimes will not help us to make that leap. We have to let go of what we have known and let God show us how it's true in an entirely different way than we ever imagined.
And so this is the time now for that leap?
I think so. And then finally Luke Acts, and I really think of it as back as the author as one continuous work. I actually think of Acts as part of the gospel. Is the story of the apostles. That word apostle means those who are sent. And this is those who have made the journey from change through trials and obstacles to the new insight. Here is how you will take this new good news out to others. And it's not an easy message, because I always talk about Luke Acts as it's the suffering of love, where we agree to keep offering the newness, not by force, but by the will of our deep love for others until they wake up. In the States, I will often end my talks with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I tell the story of how when I was a small boy in Alabama, the KKK, which is a terrorist organization, burned down my grandmother's house because we were Lebanese and Catholic. Martin Luther King Jr. said these words in those days. He said, "Send your hooded perpetrators, KKK, send them into our neighborhoods at the midnight hour. Burn our homes, beat our children, break our bones, and we will not hate you. We cannot in good conscience obey unjust laws, and we will win our freedom. But by grace, we will so appeal to your heart and to your conscience by our ability to suffer, that when we win our freedom, the victory will be twofold, for we will have won yours as well." To me, every word of Luke Acts sings with that truth.
Alexander John Shaia, thank you. May our Celtic and our Navajo ancestors, our Middle Eastern apostolic ancestors, pray with us now. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.